Do you want to learn how you can get the customer to tell you, the salesperson, the exact steps and processes needed to close the deal to make your life easier? Then this is the episode for you. Hello, Sales Nation, and welcome to today's episode of the Salesman podcast. On today's show, we have Jeff Koser. He is the CEO of sellingtozebras.com. On today's show, he's explaining what a zebra is. Essentially, it's a really amazing, super niche and targeted prospect that you've got a good chance of winning business with. So how to define, narrow down, and find them. And then how to do things such as build an amazing business case collaboratively with people in the account so that when it goes off to procurement, they just sign off on it and everything goes hunky-dory with the close. You can find out more about Jeff over at salesmanpodcast.com in the show notes. And with all that said, let's jump in to today's show. Jeff, welcome to the Salesman Podcast.
Hey, Will. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad to have you on, sir. I'm glad to dive into a topic today which is going to be multifaceted. It's going to have multiple layers. And so we'll see how quick we can go deep into this. The topic is understanding essentially the business problems that our products solve from the customer's perspective, what they're telling us that we solve. But before we add another layer of complexity of the customer into the mix here, do you think that I don't want to say the average salesperson, because the people listening to this show now, they're going out of their way to improve themselves, to listen to a sales podcast. So they're very likely either newish to sales and want to improve quickly, or they are somewhat seasoned and want to climb up the ranks, as opposed to the quote-unquote average salesperson who's not quite hitting target and just plods along. So with that in mind, do you think that, say, Sales Nation, the audience, do you think that they really understand the business problems that their products are solving versus clearly they know the features and benefits? Do you think that they know that one step deeper of the value that they're adding to the customer?
I think they know the value they're adding to the customer, but they may not know why. And what I mean by that is oftentimes, we've done research on this, and we've done a lot of research over the last couple of years. And when you ask sellers, or even when you ask the CEO of a company, what business problem do you solve for your customer? You almost always get an answer that starts to describe their product, the features, its functions, or the things they're excited about, but not necessarily the reason why Power, or the person that can buy even without a budget, actually approved the purchase of their solution. And that's a major difference, and it's a major disconnect. So most of the time, Will, I'd say no, they don't.
So to give us context here, Jeff, what is a example of a business problem that a product solves, just so that we're on the same wavelength with everyone, myself included, and the audience?
Yeah, so you're an excellent question asker, which is why I like listening to your podcast.
I'll tell you why, Jeff, because I want to be sure and have clarity on this myself, so I don't mislead anyone. Because I think I know what the business problems that I've solved in the past, but it could very well that I'm in this catchment that doesn't know them. So I'm glad for you to explain it further.
So I'll give you an example from a manufacturer. So a manufacturer that makes highly engineered plastic parts. So the dashboard in your automobile. That dashboard, for example, is plastic, it's substrate, it's printed on, and it has to be exact because there's LED lights behind that dashboard today. So light can't seep through anywhere where it's not supposed to seep through. So that's just one example of something they make, right? So when they would approach an automotive manufacturer, all the big guys included, they would talk about how complex their product is to get it right. They'd talk about the engineer to order capability. They'd talk about their deep chemical understanding, their substrate understanding, their ability to generate quality parts, certainly, right? So parts per million that, would boggle the mind, right? Very few defects. But when we talked with their customer, and we did what we call a voice of the customer exercise, which is just what you'd think it would be. And we asked Power why they bought. Power didn't bring up any of those things. Power basically said, we buy from them, and their name is Serigraph, the name of the company that I'm giving an example about. We buy because they never shut down our manufacturing production line. And I thought, just like you would, I thought, that's interesting. What's the average number of times that your tier one suppliers bring down your line? And they said 2.5 times a year. And I said, wow. I said, what does that cost? They said $250,000 on average per time. So imagine the cost avoidance that Serigraph was creating for this customer, and this happened to be Honda, the cost avoidance they were creating, and they never even thought about it that way. So it was really their ability to create a supply chain that never brought down that customer. Now that's huge value, and that's hard for a competitor to compete against. So that's a problem they didn't even know they solved.
Let me see if I can add a formula to this somewhat of, is it that you have your product, it hits all the requirements, perhaps no one's really thrilled about it. I've got a degree in chemistry and I can only get so thrilled about plastics. So you have it and it solves all the problems. It meets all the specifications is probably a better way to describe it. And then on top of that, is that where you see then the acute business problems it solves, which is it's super reliable, which is the case in that example? Do you have to tick all the boxes and then there's an extra layer which exceeds expectations, and that's the differentiator between you and the competition?
Well, it probably depends on the industry for that answer, right? So if you're in an old line industry where to grow you have to steal market share from someone else, what you just described is probably the case. If you're more in a high growth industry, either a new idea, disruptive idea, something like that, it might not be where you have to be over and above, say, commodity status at all. But what's interesting is that the voice of the customer exercise always produces surprising results. And by the very definition of surprising, we don't know what that result will be, right?
So let me get this straight in my head from the process of the people listening of how they can implement this. Is this for keeping customers? And it might not be the salesperson that'll do it. It might be a third party, someone is impartial perhaps, but you or the third party interviews the customer, susses out why they love you, and then that is then your ammunition to keep them on board by keeping that specific thing top of mind, by keeping that, if it's the reliability that they are super excited about, which means that they continue buying from you, you double down on that, you focus on that, you make sure that never slips. Or is there a way to turn this around so that then you can use that information to sell your product to new customers, or use it as a competitive advantage against incumbent accounts and things of that nature?
It's absolutely both. And the reason it's both. So let's go back to the beginning. So you on your show, you often talk about how busy buyers are today. They're overwhelmed. Sellers are, and automation is inundating them with information, and they're expecting us to know more about them, not less about them. So the pace of business is faster, and we're expected to know more. So the only way you can approach a prospect and actually know more and earn the right to have a conversation with power is if you actually refine who you're going after and you really know that segment really well. We call those customers where you bring unique value, where you'd win 9 out of 10. We call those zebras. And we have a way of identifying who those zebras are. And the definition of a zebra isn't just who you want as a new customer, it's also who you want to retain as an existing customer. And the process of actually creating that scenario starts with a cross-functional conversation within your own company. So it's not just the sales department or the biz dev department defining what a zebra looks like. It's everyone cross-functionally across the management team participating. But then when you're done, what you do is you actually...
Let me just stop you here for a second, Jeff.
Okay.
That, when you give us some context on that, are you saying the salesperson says, well, I want an account that does X, Y, Z that I have access to, and then you have your financial team come in and say, well, we need to deal with an account of a certain size that can pay us on time. And then you have marketing come in who can say, well, our account that, our ideal customer essentially does X, Y, Z is online so that we can give them content online. And then you you amalgamate all that together into your zebra.
That's correct. But you do it together as a team. You do it cross-functionally as a team with a collaborator working through those issues and having the conversation so that each different department learns from the other's perspective and so that you also agree on what that first version, the straw man version, if you will, of the zebra looks like. And then what you do, Will, is you go verify it with your customer. That's again where this voice of the customer comes in because you may think you know the problem you solve, but until you actually get it in the eyes and in the words of your customer, you don't have that message refined the way you should in order to put together a winning strategy to go earn the right to have conversations with more of those.
So this could be a question that is probably a 10-hour seminar that you train people up on to go in and do this. But how do we say so we use Sam the salesperson. He's in SaaS. He's selling some kind of SaaS product to accountants. So that's the most boring thing that for some reason came to the top of my mind. Don't know why. I think I've used that example before in the past as well. So Sam is selling a SaaS accounting software to a specific vertical. He's got already a couple of good accounts, but he wants to find more zebras. Is this literally he's going to those accounts and asking them with open arms, hey, why do you buy from us? Is it as simple as that, or is it more nuanced, or is it just crazy complex because there's obviously multiple buyers and multiple decision makers and multiple reasons why within that account? How do we go for myself and the audience listening? How would they implement some of this?
You can ask customers yourself, but we actually have a free ebook on our website called Voice of the Customer, and it describes how you go about doing this. And it's where it gets a little bit more complex is very often if we ever met power during the process of engaging with a prospect and soon to be customer, it's usually during that buying cycle. But after power buys, they might go away. So if we met them once, we probably don't still have a relationship. And a lot of times we might have sold without ever even having met power. And the real goal of the voice of the customer is to get from power's perspective what business problem you solved in their eyes. So if you don't know who power is and you don't have a current relationship, that's where it gets a little bit tricky. And what we do in the Voice of the Customer ebook is we tell you how to define who power is, how to identify power, how to earn the right to have just even meet or get to talk with power, and then we describe how you frame the questions and prepare those questions so that you can get the type of data you're looking for. And our goal when we do this, our goal is metrics based. So it's not just, did we do this better than someone? It's how much better. And when we solve this business problem, how much value did we actually create? So if you notice when we were talking about that example before about when we talked to Honda, we talked to Honda on behalf of our customer. And we got real specific about how many times does another supplier bring you down on average per year, and what does it cost you, and how do you know that, and how many people are involved. So I didn't give you any of the real boring details. I gave you just the highlights, but that gives you the idea.
Okay, well, we'll link to the ebook in the show notes for this episode over at salesmanpodcast.com. And just to go that one layer deeper with it, clearly power is your terminology here. Are we only focused on the person who spends the cash with all of this that we've talked about so far and what we're going to go into? Is that all that obviously I'm choosing my words carefully because clearly that's not all that matters. Everyone matters, the end user matters, but for the process that we're going through now of uncovering other zebras, maybe I'll phrase it as this: is a zebra a company, an account, or is a zebra a person within an account that can make the buying decision?
So you've got about 3 questions wrapped up in there along the way. But a zebra consists of 7 attributes. So the first one is the type of company where you do particularly well. And it's the things you'd expect. It's the demographics, the size, those types of things. But it's also the culture. The companies have a culture and they fit better with others that have a matching culture. So it's a process for defining that. The second is operations, and that's where you get into the types of business problems that you solve for your customer and the value that you create by solving it. And those are in strategic order. So companies first, operations is second, and third is power. And power is the person that we said before has a simple definition. It's who can buy even without a budget, which means they have the power to either create a budget or move budget around, right? And third is funding. So what's the adequate level of funding for a solution like yours? Next is ROI or value. Next is technology. And seventh is service. So those are the 7 attributes. And then what we prescribe is that you use a red, yellow, green for scoring each. So we go from 0 to 4. 0 and 1 are red, 2 is yellow, and 3 and 4 are green. So each one of those attributes can be red, yellow, or green. And then the total score of those 7 adds up to something that is red, yellow, or green. So it's very visible. Everybody in the company can figure it out. Everybody in the company can know where you are with a deal, question whether or not you really have a zebra or not, and see where the holes are in your deal. So your question was, do you just sell to power? The answer is no. But what we're trying to do is have an initial conversation at the very beginning, maybe just a 15-minute conversation or maybe just a 15-minute webinar like you and I are having, just to establish that power, first of all, you've identified a business that really has the problem you solve. And 2, the power will acknowledge that they agree they have it and they want to solve it. Then you ask for permission to work with the people that power trusts to collaboratively solve that problem. And now you do what you normally do best, which is work with those people who would normally make the decision to say yes or no to your product. But do you see the difference? You've now queued it up at the front end with a brief affirmation that it's worth it for that company to invest in working through a sales cycle, or preferably what we like to call a buying cycle when you do it this way.
So just so I've got clarity here, Jeff, are we, because it's almost chicken and egg, but are we sussing out whether the buyer has the problem that we think that we let me
yeah, the answer is yes. You were going down the right path.
So we're almost building a funnel of the people that we think that we solve the problem, and then are we then clarifying and asking them the problem that we solve for them, whether it's actually true or not? Does that make sense? Are we having a bigger catchment of we think we can help these people? Then a step down, it's we've asked them, they've told us that essentially, because in a sales conversation, if you have the conversation that goes literally, we think you can help us, clearly that's a huge buying signal. So is that what all of this is aiming towards? Of you have features and benefits, they lead to a business problem solved or a business solution that they didn't know, the prospect didn't know that they were going to have. Is our goal to end the conversation, and obviously the conversation could be one conversation or 6 months of going back and forth, but to end it with the prospect telling us that you as a sales professional and your product is going to fill a hole in our in a solution that we're trying to build.
So the answer is,
I'm confusing myself here, Jeff. Going back and forth with all of this.
Perhaps I'm confusing you, but the answer is a quantifiable yes. What I say quantifiable, what I mean by that is you've done your homework, so you found evidence they really do have the problem you solve. So you do some research, and we actually have software that finds zebras for you. That's really the first step. Zero in on your zebra is the first step. So you've got a pretty darn good idea they have the problem you solve. Now you're just trying to find person in a position of power, and there's not just one person, particularly in larger companies there might be 4 or 5 who might have the problem. but you want them to acknowledge that it's a top of mind or could be top of mind enough that they would actually care to solve it. And if you could, what we do, we actually arm the sellers will with a preliminary business case, a hypothesis of value, if you will. So now what you can do for power is you can frame for them, look, given your size, given your industry, I'm pretty good at this because this is where I focus. You're my zebra, and you can explain what that means. And we actually, I don't want to turn this into too salesy, but we actually give a seller software that allows you to show a prospect that they really are your zebra with proof. Here's where we've done it before. Here's our hypothesis of value, our preliminary business case. Is this interesting? And could this be top of mind if we could get the people you trust to verify that we could actually create this level of value by solving this? So you're asking them to endorse your journey and go on a buyer's process with you.
So you've explained it perfectly there. So there's a gap here that I was struggling with, and you just explained it. So the elements of it being quantifiable, the element of building a theoretical business case proposition, however you want to define it, and then is the goal to show that to them and then have them give you the feedback of, well, it's going to solve this, but actually it could solve this. And it's probably the same problem, but reworded or twisted slightly. But they're giving us the feedback then that we can run with of it is then bespoke and custom to them. Is that's the gap I think I was struggling with of how we go from, I think this is your problem, to them telling us what the problem is.
And you're right when you say us telling them what their problem is. You kind of hit on something where it takes some sales verve to do that right, because you don't want to come across as the least bit arrogant, because you're not. You're really just trying to earn the right to have a meaningful conversation. So you're trying to prove that you care enough about them, that you chose wisely. You did your homework. You identified them who you think really owns the problem in the company, and you don't want to waste their time, and you don't want to waste any of their people's time either, which is why, unless they endorse your participation with the subject matter experts that they trust, you're not going to pursue it.
Is that a question that we should ask? Is that a part of a conversation of and I don't know if I personally would use the word endorse. There might be a different term that I would use, but should
Sponsor.
we be sponsors? Perfect. Should we be saying the phrase and not wussing out on this, because clearly it's a direct action that you're asking for from another individual, but should we be asking I'm making notes here, so I'm using all your terminology, should we be asking the power whether they will sponsor us, and then shutting up and waiting for a yes or no response from them?
The answer is yes. So here's the way we define it, and it doesn't have to be in these steps, but you want these steps somewhere in the process. There's no magic in our process other than we move that conversation with power, which in many buying cycles doesn't happen until you get all the way to the end after you've expended so much time and resource. We move it up front and we give them everything they need to make a decision. So here's the problem. Do you have it? Do you care to solve it? Here's the value attached to solving it. And will you invest some of your people's time in it? Because it's not free. There's disruption to your business. It'll take time to verify it. So that first step in the process is zero in on zebras and only pursue zebras. The second is identify all the individuals who you think might be power. Like we talked about before, that could be 4 or 5, a big company, that could be 4 or 5 per division, right? The third step is actually meeting with power and having this meeting we're talking about. And at the end of that meeting, I like to ask, look, if I can verify that we can create this level of value through the people you trust, and that'll happen in the next step if you'll endorse me, if you'll sponsor me, then I'd like to know if you'd be inclined to buy. It's a fair business question. It's not one of those always be closing questions, right? Because you've done it with some sales verve, right? Then the next step, if they do say yes, if she says yes, I will give you access to the people I trust. Now you collaboratively verify your value, and that next step we actually call it partner to verify value. Then the fifth step is collaboratively present the results back to power. So when you originally presented to power, you had a hypothesis. It was based on some pretty good data. You did your homework. You've got references that are really similar to them, and you've created value that they verified. So you've got proof. You took them through a process that with the people they trust. Now you're back co-presenting the results. So it's not yours anymore. It's collaboratively produced. So it's their people's, really their people's business case, if you will.
This makes total sense. And Jeff, let me just jump in here because I think I've got. Tell me if I'm. Tell me if I'm totally off on this, and I'm sure you will. You'll be honest with me. I think I've actually done something similar to this in the past, by more fluke than process. But hopefully this will give context for myself and the audience if I'm on the right track with it. And that is, there was this is in the NHS selling endoscopes, essentially glass steel rods with glass within them. They get broken somewhat regularly, and they're about £3,000 a pop. So not something that you want to be dropping on the floor. I went into this one account in the decontamination suite. The lady she had the budget to buy, essentially replace all the scopes, but they were continuously getting broken. So I went in, essentially give a pricing to replace everything, and then spent. It was a big deal for me at the time, kind of a big chunk of my yearly target. So I spent a bunch of time with her, and it was essentially shown that there was no point in replacing them unless we uprated the repair service, and we give them some service contracts, so it made it cheaper when things did get broken. And we went through it all with her. So everyone was happy. The problem it had was procurement were tight-fisted and didn't want to spend any money that financial year, even though in year 2 and year 3 they would be saving money on all of this. So, and the reason this came to mind is because I really vividly remember having this conversation with her, and I didn't use the word sponsor. I literally just said to her, if I put essentially a business case for you together, I'll do all the paperwork, I'll write it all up, it'll all be pretty. You can just hand it to procurement to get them to sign off on it. Like, have you got my back? They were the exact words that I used. Have you got my back? As in, there's no, essentially trying to communicate with her that there's no point in me investing all this time, effort, energy if you're not going to give back and be on our team, because we both want the same result. And it came through, and it was a great deal, and we did really well with it. But is that kind of like to wrap up everything that we talked about so far, is that the use case of this?
That is an exact example of it.
Because that was, I wish this podcast existed, because I probably would have done that more often. That was just fluke. Tell you what that was, Jeff. That was just, I had a really good relationship with this lady because I'd spent so much time in there because they had so many problems. And there wasn't, this is why I like these conversations when they go slightly deeper. It wasn't that I was trying to influence her, manipulate her, close the deal. It was that I'd spent so much time there. She was getting so much stress about, essentially, without boring everyone, the scope is used. It's inside a patient. Surgeon's looking through it. They're doing the laparoscopy. They're doing their keyhole surgery. It goes off. It's lightly cleaned in a tub. Someone physically holds it. This is where they're all getting smashed about because the people weren't trained on how to clean them. Then they go into a sterilization unit. They're autoclaved. They go back to the surgeon, but they weren't being checked throughout this process. So the surgeons then were getting these endoscopes. Patients unconscious, all drugged up. They're all anesthetized. The scope goes in. The surgeon can't. It's just milky on the screen. That's all they can see. And the surgeon then rings up this lady and goes absolutely nuts at her, and obviously makes her look bad, makes her department look bad, and obviously, there's a stereotype of surgeons being loud and potentially obnoxious on occasion, and that's what she was getting consistently. So it wasn't that I was strategic in what I was doing, and hopefully the audience can be now that you've explained this so well, Jeff. But it was just that I really cared about solving her problem, so I spent so much time there. So that led me to say to her, I'll go beyond what I'll do for any other customer. I'll do all this for you because I want to see your problem being solved. And there's almost a paradox there of, as soon as you take away, you're chasing money and you do it because you're trying to really solve a problem, it just flows, and the deal typically, I find, comes in easier, right?
That's an impassioned example and a great story. And that, to me, that's what we're trying to create with every one of these buying cycles. If you if you can, it's maybe it's one of those things you can't teach salespeople to care, right? But if you are passionate about solving the problem you solve, and you focus on zebras where you can truly learn what should keep them up at night, right? You can't go into an account and say what keeps you up at night. That's the worst question of all, for the last 10 years, right? They expect you to know. So if you go in and say this is what should keep you up at night because you're an account, you're my zebra, this is what I found. I did my homework. I listened to your last quarterly transcript or something along those lines. And I tried to earn the right to have this conversation with you because I'm passionate about solving this business problem. You're trying to have an authentic connection with them. What you described was an authentic connection with that woman that you were selling to. You cared to ease her pain, and hers was a true pain, right? She was physically and probably impacted when a surgeon would call her up and say, "Hey, you got in the way of me performing surgery on a patient who's on my table." That's one of those literal. I don't know if it was life or death, but it certainly could be. So those are far more traumatic than what most sellers have, but that is the type of authentic connection you're trying to create and be able to do on a repeatable basis.
What happens when you speak to your zebra and they aren't that bothered about the problem? Does that mean that they are not, like by definition, they are not a zebra? As in, we've gone from the right company, the right culture, we've got to the power, and perhaps we're getting further down to the end user as we go down through the funnel of what you described before, Jeff. Does that mean that they're just not a zebra and we should move on? Or how can I describe this without sounding weird and manipulative? Should we, if they're not aware of the problem and it's a big problem, is it our job to let them know what a big problem that could potentially be in the future? Or again, is it best to just go after the low-hanging fruit, move on to the next person or the next company that's more suited to your product?
So assuming you've done a good job of describing the problem and the value of solving it, if there's still no interest, that person is not your zebra. Now, if they're large enough and there's 3 or 4 others who might be power for your solution, you're not done until you actually get an audience with those 3 or 4 others, right? But a good answer could actually be where they acknowledge, hey, we have this problem, but it's not one of the top 2 or 3 things that I'm working on right now because. And usually when you do it in a professional manner like this with a preliminary business case, and you framed it and you said hypothetically this is the value we could create, they'll share more information about their priorities with you because you've earned it. And when they do, they might say, this is what's on my plate, for example, for the rest of 2017. But 2018, this might rise to the top. Or you might ask, look, I've also identified these 3 other individuals who might be power for our solution. And again, given the homework I did, would you introduce me to them, or does this make business sense that they could potentially be people that I should talk to and bring my hypothesis of value to and have a conversation with? And that would create, usually if you've done a good job, they will give you deeper information and might even introduce you because you've earned it.
I love this. You were very polite there as well, Jeff. I was thinking more along the lines of when the person who has the power, and we'll use big accounts so that we can hopefully solve the problem, but when they're either just a job's worth, they don't care about the role, or they're an idiot, and you're, obviously I'm hypervising here slightly, but there's been plenty of accounts I've gone into where I know that I'm going to save them money, they're going to have better patient out, which is a physical, someone is going to be better off for using this product in this procedure. Someone's going to literally have better hips or knees or whatever it is, whatever the problem that product was solving. There's a person at the end of it who they are literally going to be able to run, whereas prior they might not have been able to. And you can go as deep as you want into this tale of they can now chase their kids around and they can kneel down and pick up their loved ones and all this kind of stuff. But you get to certain individual and they know they're not going to be in the job in 12 months' time. They just want a super easy ride. They don't want to be taking on new big projects, even though they can see that there's potential benefit to it. And I think you give me the solution here of then you ask them to introduce you to someone else who can implement it. Is that the best strategy?
It is. But in the end, you might find out that they really aren't your zebra. And it could be because of that cultural fit. It might go all the way back up to that first attribute we were talking about, company, right? And maybe there just isn't a fit. And what we teach is if the first two aren't green, so if the company and operations are not green, so that those two scores aren't at least a 3 or a 4, you should shake the dust from your feet and should walk to another town. Another way of saying find another prospect, because the process just worked for you, because you might have wasted quarters or even years and never sold them anything. Or if it's a SaaS model like you talked about before, maybe you'd sell them something for a year and then they'd go away, which is even worse.
I'm going to ask you a question here. I genuinely don't know the answer to it, but I'm intrigued. So this clearly works for the complex B2B sale. So me selling medical devices to the NHS, it's from anywhere from 6 months to 3 or 4 years if I was selling a full operating theatre, which would be millions and millions and millions of pounds. How or does even this model work when someone is listening, perhaps they are sat there cold calling and say it's not necessarily a crazy complex product, but there might be multiple decision makers in it. And maybe it's inside sales, perhaps, as opposed to field sales where you sat down with people. Does this model still work for them when, and just to make it real, the boss is shouting at them every morning because Sally, who's sat next to Sam, has made 20 more cold calls in the day than what they have?
I'm with many of the other people that you've had on this show. I don't believe in dialing for dollars and doing activity management. I believe in quality, and my experience with that goes all the way back to my very first job out of college. I was working for NCR Corporation, and I actually tell this story in the book, and all the characters in the book, Selling to Zebras, have been changed. The names have been changed except one. And that's Scotty, and he was my boss. So the first year I made my numbers at NCR, I got a note from Scotty penned in his hand that said, "Congratulations on making the Century Point Club," right? The 100% club. "But your activity levels are too low. You've got to get your calls, your surveys, your demos, your proposals up." And it was right at that moment that I knew that I did not believe in that type of activity management because it didn't lead to success. So to answer your question, does this process work when it's maybe more frequent sales, maybe fewer steps, maybe smaller ticket items? So I would answer it with a qualified yes. The first piece where you can score your prospects, anybody can do that. Anybody can answer that and do it in 2 minutes. You can score all 7 attributes, know exactly where you stand, and have a predictable forecast. But the other part of it is it depends on whether or not they benefit from having a business case around it. And that's how I would answer that question. So if they would benefit from a business case, then they can use it, and it can be simplified to help them.
Love it, love it. And I think anyone who isn't at least building business cases for some of their customers needs to move to a more complex sales role before their role disappears. I'm going to say that on record, and I won't kind of put you on the line for that, Jeff, but that's something I really believe the audience should truly think about if they're not going that far, that they are dealing with multiple decision makers, dealing with end users, and pulling it all together. And that's the value that they're adding in the conversation versus just giving someone information and allowing someone to buy through them. That is essentially a website and an online order form. So I really, I talk about it all the time, but I really encourage yet again the listeners to have a think about the role that they're in if that's what they're doing. And this reminds me, this is something I'm gonna ask the audience something here, Jeff. Of if there's anyone in the UK that's working in a role that they're proud of, where they are cold calling and they are adding value, drop me an email, will@salesmanpodcast.com, and let me know, because depending on the product or service, I would love to spend a day there, 2 days there, just seeing what's going on. Because I've never cold called. I've only ever worked for medical device companies that proactively the surgeons want me to go in because they want to play with all the new toys that I've got. So I think for my business acronym, as we're talking about these subjects, Sales Nation, if there's anyone here and you think you can get me a day in the office, in the boiler room, seeing what's going on, perhaps even having a go myself, and I won't charge you for the privilege, or the whether it would be me charging you or you charging me, I'm not sure. I think that'll be a useful kind of YouTube video for the website. So I appreciate that, Jeff. And with that, mate, I've got one final question. That's something to ask everyone that comes on the show, and that is, if you, sir, could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling?
I would tell him to go to work for a startup sooner. And the reason I say that is because at a startup, you get to help solve the problems. You get to figure it out. You get to become part of the solution that the company puts together, and you get to make a difference. You're not just part of a numbers machine. I joined a startup 3 years into my career, Will, and it was a small computer company, that nobody had ever heard of, called MAI Basic 4. And we sold to entrepreneurs who had the courage of their convictions to buy from us because they'd never heard of us. And we competed with IBM at that time and HP and DEC, Digital Equipment Corporation, when they were still around. And we had to solve a business problem and bring a solution that spoke to an owner because we were selling to owners. And you learn so much, and you impact the company, and if you're a strong contributor, everyone all the way up to the CEO knows who you are. And that, to me, that's just a lot more fun.
Is that advice potentially for the audience of, even if they don't envision themselves in startup life, because obviously it's a different pace than the corporate world, for example, is that something that they should consider doing for a year, 2 years, just to get that wider business acronym, to get used to dealing with their own CEO, when you sat next to them on the table, or, their office is just there versus you're in Leeds and their office is in Shanghai? Is that how to describe it? Almost like worth it as an internship to widen your sales knowledge and your business and your industry knowledge? Is that how to describe it? Is that a worthy investment of their time if they want to be a career-long salesperson?
So I think that's advice for me because it fits me. I'm not sure it fits everyone. The startups that I joined. So the first one, it actually was a $500 million company. So they were $500 million in revenues, but at that time, IBM was whatever they were. Let's just say 30, 40 billion, right?
Sure.
So we were a gnat compared to them, and digital equipment at that time was probably, let's say, 5-10 billion, whatever they were. So we were a very small player, but we were still a substantial company. But you had to figure it out. There wasn't so this is why I say it has to fit your personality. Everyone thinks that they want to become a pioneer. It sounds sexy to become a pioneer. But the reality of being a pioneer in the Old West was 50% of them died on the trail with arrows in their back, right? And that's what happens in a startup. So you have to be ready to figure it out. You have to like that. If a presentation isn't prepared, you got to prepare it. If there is another piece that's missing, you got to figure it out and create it. And you have to like that. That's not for everybody.
Fair enough. That is great context. I appreciate that. And Jeff, with that, mate, tell us a little bit about selling to zebras.com. Tell us a little bit about the book as well, because that'll tie some of this together. And then where we can find out more about you as well.
So I'll tell you our why first. So our goal is to change the way the world sells, and literally to make it a better place by doing that. So every seller only calls on a buyer where they've done their homework. They know they have the business problem they solve, and they only pursue that sale if that buyer will acknowledge having the problem and a desire to solve it. Now, doesn't that feel like a better world if they actually sold that way?
It sounds like a world where I want to engage with the people who are calling me as opposed to just not answer the calls.
Exactly. And we have software that does that. We have software that takes a buyer on a buyer's journey. It literally follows the hero method. And by that I mean there's this void. So the hero has a void. They have a problem. They have something they want to solve. Think Luke Skywalker from Star Wars, right? There's a disruption in the Force. He's got a problem. So he goes on a quest. Now maybe he's even unwillingly on a quest, but a buyer is on a quest to solve a problem. So now you've got a mentor who might come in to help. That's Obi-Wan Kenobi, right? In staying with the Salesforce motif, right? So now your product is the treasure, but the hero is the person on the quest. So you want to make the buyer the hero, not your product. The product's the treasure, but only if you mentor them and help them fill their void and on their quest. Then you can bring them to the treasure, and then you can create mastery. And the mastery, we try to do that with the software by giving every situation a way to collaboratively move to the next step and do it where you do it right with the participants in the software. You're making presentations that they collaboratively produce. You're getting agreement to go to the next step to ensure it makes sense. And then when you go into negotiations, like you mentioned at the front end, you're in a very different situation because you've got a collaboratively produced business case that everybody agreed on. Not that purchasing won't still try to beat you up, because they will, right? But they're different. If Power introduces you to purchasing, they say, we have this problem we want to solve. Here's the value of solving it. And then the last piece of it, there's promises that are made. So Power is going to make promises to the business around the problem being solved and the value created. You've got to close that circle. You got to close that cycle. We call that forcing success. So when you sell like this, you have to stay involved and make sure that they actually achieve the value. Kind of like you talked about with your glass rods, you had to stick around to make sure that the end result was what that woman wanted. And then you close the loop and you close the cycle and you create a reoccurring cycle that gives you more proof of your value claim when you pursue Power for the next deal, gives you better knowledge of those zebras that you help, and it gives you more passion around the way you sell it.
Love it. I up to you, Jeff. But I'd love to have you back on in the future to dive into even just this, because we only glossed over it, but I think it's super valuable in itself. Building a business case collaboratively, having even to use your Star Wars metaphor even further, of having Luke Skywalker on the front of the business case and you're kind of in Obi-Wan or Yoda is at the back pages as, I helped with this, but they're the star of the show. They uncovered the problems, and I just helped them with any data or industry insights I could come along with. I think that would be a powerful show in itself.
I would love to do that, and I could see you asking a lot of good questions around that topic.
Well, we'll see. I'll try my best, but yeah, I think that'd be a useful one, because I don't think there's anything that when you come up against procurement, and especially so here in the UK, the NHS is a government body. They don't want to spend anything because they haven't got anything to spend. But when you give them, like, everyone listening now, I'm going to bang on the table so you don't think I've just collapsed and fell over. But when you get this big document and go, and you put it in front of them, and it's got 2 or 3 surgeons' names on it, it's got the theatre manager's name on it, it's got insights from them as opposed to just you as the supplier just trying to pitch them with stuff. I don't think there's anything like that. And it also puts you in the front position from a specification, from a tender perspective, because then everyone's somewhat lazy. The procurement team, when they put the tender out, they're just using the specifications that you provided them. They're just copying and pasting it. So immediately you're the front runner of all of this, and people are trying to compete with you as opposed to you jumping in the process later on. So love it, Jeff. As I said, love to have you back on to dive onto this further. And with that, mate, I want to thank you for your time, your insights and all of this, and for joining us on the Salesman podcast.
Thanks, Will. It was wonderful being here.